Having made a couple of slideshows earlier concerning the history of Bukharian Jews, as well as Mountain Jews and Georgian Jews, I would like to now share a copy of a video that I presented earlier this year for the Sephardic American Mizrahi Initiative, a nonprofit organization for college students, high school students, and young professionals founded by my friend Menashe Chaimov. The lesson talked about the history of Bukharian, Georgian, and Caucasian Jews during World War II. Because often when we think about World War II, we think about the big parade in Red Square in Moscow and the big rally in Times Square that took place on May 8th, 1945, when World War II ended. But since then, here on the western side of the globe, we haven't really celebrated or discussed much about World War II because the United States was buffered from most of the combat by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, even though more than 500,000 people in America were affected by the war. In the Soviet Union, the story was different, with more than 20 million Soviet citizens killed in the war, many of them Jewish, but really from all nationalities, civilians, and combat veterans as well. We think about the Jewish experience on the Eastern Front of World War II. The story is often the Holocaust by bullets. When the Nazi armies crossed the Soviet border on June 22nd, 1941, and within the occupied Baltics, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and Russia, there were few concentration camps and certainly no trains taking people to death camps like Auschwitz. Instead, it was the outright murder of people by the Germans and their local collaborators. Throughout the former Soviet Union, there are memorials to those who fought in World War II and those who died. Memorials can be found in places like Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and throughout the republics within the Russian Federation. Some of the monuments are about the heroism, and other monuments are about the grieving widows and mothers. Because even though the parade on May 9th in Red Square every year is very triumphant, there's a huge civilian toll to the war that no other nation in World War II has suffered, largely because of Stalin's blunder of trusting Hitler until Hitler launched a surprise invasion in 1941. Among the Bukharian Jews, these are the Jews of Central Asia, a community of nearly 100,000 strong at the outbreak of World War II, living mostly in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, with smaller numbers in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. At the outbreak of the war, the Nazi atrocities against the Jews were common knowledge throughout the Soviet Union. At the same time, there was also the desire for the minority peoples of the Soviet Union to prove their worth and their loyalty and patriotism to the country in the hope that would result in recognition and better treatment. And so for many Bukharian Jews, before even being called up to fight, many of them volunteered. In total, between 350,000 and 500,000 Jews had served in the Red Army. That's Jews from all across the Soviet Union. The losses ranged between 120,000 and 142,000. And we will never know how many of those casualties were killed for being identified as Jews and how many of them died in the Red Army uniform simply in the line of fire. Among Bukharian Jews, the number estimated of those who fought in World War II is nearly 15,000, with nearly half of them killed or missing in action. That means that among the Bukharian Jews of Central Asia, almost every family knew somebody who did not come back from the war. In 2005, the Congress of Bukharian Jews of USA and Canada had a historic commemorative event in Forest Hills, Queens, for the surviving veterans in that community. The event featured diplomats from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Russia, Israel, and local elected officials. The event included a documentary by Ben Isakov, who was born in Turkmenistan, a filmmaker, and a bilingual English and Russian book featuring the stories of these veterans called They Upheld the Peace, Отстоявшие мир, stories of Bukharian Jewish veterans of World War II, that was published in Queens, New York. Today, the number of Bukharian Jewish veterans, their average age is in the mid-90s. That means they were teenagers when the war broke out. There are very few of them left. This photo is from about 10 years ago, showing Rabbi Baruch Babayev of the Congress of Bukharian Jews, President Boris Kondov, Bukharian Times publisher Raphael Nektalov, and Rabbis Wallowik and Zvolunov of the Bukharian Jewish Congress, celebrating the surviving veterans. At the time of the outbreak of the war, the minority Jewish communities of the Soviet Union, again, less than 10% of the Jewish population of the Soviet Union, those Mountain Jews, the Caucasian Mountain Jews, the Georgian Jews, the Bukharian Jews, were less than 10% of the much larger Jewish population, which was overwhelmingly Ashkenazi. They kept their religion in private, within their homes and courtyards. As a rule, younger people did not attend synagogue because there were government informants there and they could lose their reputations, such as their jobs and economic prospects. So religion was a private affair. There were Jewish collective farms that spoke Yiddish or Bukharian Jewish or the Tat language of Mountain Jews, but most of these Jewish collective farms were broken apart by 1938 when Stalin felt that the Jews were not assimilating enough and they should be assimilated into the larger Soviet population. So after stripping them of their religion, stripped them of their culture. These are pictures of Jewish voters in a rigged election where the outcome is hanging on the wall. But nevertheless, the Soviet Union did have elections that were, again, predetermined. This is a picture of a Jewish collective farm among mountain Jews. And you can see posters of Lenin, Voroshilov, Kaganovich, and other communist functionaries above these elderly Jews. Prior to 1938, Bukharian Jews did have a sort of cultural renaissance. They included Bukharian Jewish colleges such as INPROS, Institut Prosveshchenia, or Institute of Education. They had trade schools. They had their own newspaper called Rosh Nai, which means light, and Bayroki Michnat, which means Workers' Day. And a large group of people who published poems and plays and songs, but none of them were religious. At best, they were cultural or relating to Central Asia or praising the communist experience. But at least these were Jews who worked together. But by 1938, there was a large purge, and many of these publishers were either jailed or executed. So at the outbreak of World War II, the community was very much culturally devastated, but nevertheless felt that by proving their loyalty to the state will hopefully give them better treatment. Two early experiences on the eve of World War II was the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939, when the Japanese and Manchurian collaborators invaded the pro-Soviet Mongolia. Led by George Zhukov, a famous Soviet general, the Red Army and the Mongolian army beat back the Japanese, the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. And in that battle, there were Bukharian Jewish veterans who were part of the larger Red Army. As a result of the Soviet victory in Khalkhin Gol, Japan did not invade the Soviet Union and instead focused its attention on the British and French Southeast Asia, as well as the attack on Pearl Harbor. Another prelude to World War II was the Winter War of 1939, where the Soviet Union invaded Finland, taking the Finnish Karelia in the hope of taking all of Finland and making it a part of the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union had done with the Baltics under the Nazi-Soviet pact that divided Eastern Europe between the Nazi and the Soviet sphere. The Finnish army fought back fiercely. I think more than 200,000 Soviet dead as a result of the Finnish defense, but nevertheless, the Soviet Union simply had more manpower and less regard for human life. So Finland lost 10% of its territory. But in the Winter War of 1939, there were also Bukharian Jewish veterans fighting under these cold conditions. Operation Barbarossa was launched on the early morning of June 22nd, 1941. And because it was a surprise invasion, the Soviet Union was caught unprepared. More than 2 million Soviet prisoners of war captured by the time that the Nazis had reached Smolensk, which is a region of Russia near the Belarusian border. And among the Soviet prisoners of war, there were Russian, Slavic prisoners, but there are also many prisoners from the Central Asian republics and the Caucasus, many of them Muslim. And the Nazis were debating whether these are the Untermenschen, not worthy of being regarded as human, just a little bit better than the Jews, but still lower than the Germans, or whether these Muslim Soviet soldiers could be recruited as collaborators in a war against communism. Most famously, the Palestinian Mufti of Jerusalem promoted this idea of Muslim collaboration with the Nazis against the communists and against the Jews. But among these Central Asian soldiers, there were also Bukharian Jews. And what will be their experience is a good question. By November 1942, the Nazi front line had been at its greatest extent. Having failed to capture Moscow, they then focused on the southeast, at the Caucasus, aiming at the oil fields of Azerbaijan in the Caspian Sea, and aiming at the city of Stalingrad to cut off the south of the Soviet Union from its center and north. And here we can divide the Bukharian Jewish veterans into three categories. There were the prisoners of war, those who were captured, and most of them were able to pass themselves off as Uzbek and Tajik, because Bukharian Jews have Central Asian first names, Central Asian last names. The Muslims of Central Asia are also circumcised, and overwhelmingly, their comrades did not inform on them. They defended them. arguing that these are fellow Central Asians. And so when Bukharian Jews were captured by the Nazis, many of them were able to avoid the Holocaust. Another example, besides prisoners of war, were combat veterans, those who fought on the front lines and were able to return home alive. Third category are labor veterans, those who fought in the factories and the collective farms, and also entertaining the troops on the front lines. Central Asian soldiers in the Red Army were accompanied by shashmakam performers who played the music of their homelands to give them a taste of home and a familiarity, so they wouldn't miss their home as they're fighting on the front lines of Eastern Europe. During World War II, Stalin relaxed some of his assimilationist policies, allowing for a little bit of religious and cultural expression, as a way of showing that the Soviet Union is better than the Nazis, and a way of boosting the morale of the soldiers of all the different nationalities. These are pictures of Central Asian prisoners of war under Nazi guard. This is a picture of a Soviet propaganda poster showing Red Army soldiers of different backgrounds and ages fighting for the legacy of Lenin and Stalin. This is a picture of a Nazi leader, Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, inspecting Soviet prisoners of war. It's another picture of captured Soviet prisoners. And here are some stories of examples of Bukharian Jewish veterans during the World War II experience. One example here is Ari Avezbakiev, an example of a combat veteran who stood out for his heroism. In the Battle of Belgorod in 1943, the platoon commander was fatally shot. Sergeant Avezbakiev rose out of his trench to lead his men. They captured 60 Germans, and his example became known beyond his immediate battlefield. But he was not awarded the Medal of Hero of Soviet Union because his lieutenant felt already enough Jews had gotten that medal, Hero of Soviet Union, and he did not want it awarded to a Jew. Nevertheless, Avezbakiev served his country throughout the entire war, marching to the Battle of Berlin, and he attended veteran reunions for many years afterwards. An example of a combat veteran who became a prisoner of war is Neryo Kandov of Samarkand. Captured by the Germans near Chernigov, Ukraine at the beginning of the war, he passed himself off as a Tajik, and his comrades supported his alibi. In 1944, he was sent to forced labor in the Netherlands to dig defensive lines against a Western invasion. He was liberated by American soldiers at the end of the war, but he wanted to go back to his family in the Soviet Union, even though he had the taste of Western freedom. The Soviets arrested him for the crime of surrendering alive to the Germans. Stalin made an order that Soviet soldiers were to fight to their deaths. So any soldier who had the misfortune of being captured alive by the Nazis and surviving Nazi captivity at the end of the war be arrested and sent to Siberia for betraying the homeland. He was arrested among the 1.5 million Red Army veterans who were first prisoners of the Nazis and then prisoners of the Soviets. Sent to hard labor in Siberia, Neryo Kandov served for 13 years. Later in his life, he made Aliyah and wrote about his experience of being imprisoned twice. He was fortunate. Another Samarkand veteran was Neryo Fuzailov, captured at Stalingrad, the deadliest battle of World War II and the turning point, the battle where my paternal grandfather lost his arm as a result of wartime injuries. Neryo Fuzailov was captured in Stalingrad, escaped back to his division, but this did not absolve him of the crime of being captured alive. In 1945, he died in a Siberian prison. Another example, Hanan Babayev, also reported of his brother Zakhar Babayev, who was captured and passed off as a Tajik to avoid becoming a Holocaust victim. Not all prisoners were as fortunate. Gavril, or Grigory Maksumov of Samarkand, was denounced as a Jew by one of his comrades and summarily executed. Mizrahi Yakubov of Kokand attempted to escape from a concentration camp in Poland, where 2,000 prisoners of war were held. A floodlight found him in the field, and he was shot instantly. The only reason we know about Mizrahi Yakubov is because one of his comrades who survived captivity was Grigory Mavashev, the only other Bukharian Jew in that prison camp. Mavashev of Samarkand returned to Tashkent, and reported to Yakubov's family. After the war, Mavashev was imprisoned for a year by the Soviets for being a Nazi prisoner. 43 years after the war, Mavashev's nephew, David Mavashev, a businessman who now lives on Long Island, was on a business trip to Poland. He visited a museum in the city of Lodz and found a book listing of the Soviet war dead, and among the names listed was Mizrahi Yakubov. And Mavashev passed that story on to the Bukharian Times newspaper in New York. Among those who did not hold weapons but who contributed to the war effort was Shoista Mulodjanova. Shostawa Shoshana Mulajanova is a people's artist of Uzbekistan who later settled in Queens, New York. Along with Fatima Koyenova, Pinchas Kurayev, and Avner Barayev of the Barayev musical dynasty, they performed on the front lines, playing music for fellow participants from Central Asia. Colonel Shumel Isakov headed the design office of the Tambovsk Artillery School, another example of a non-combat veteran. In 1943, Gavril Mulokandov, another people's artist of Uzbekistan, created a special performance troupe that performed for Central Asian workers in the Ural Mountains and Siberia. I want to point out another interesting story from the time of World War II. Moshiach Kalantarov, Moshiach or Marek Kalantarov, was a veteran from the city of Samarkand. And in 1944, just as the Soviet Union was beginning Operation Bagration to reconquer the Baltic states and march on to Nazi-occupied Poland, unfortunately, Moshiach Kalantarov died outside of the city of Pskov in a small swampy village called Usy, about a 5-hour drive from Leningrad. For nearly 20 years, his grave was not known to his family. All they knew was that he had been killed in combat. About 25 years after the war, his family found the grave, which is a mass grave of soldiers, and visited it. And a couple of years ago, in 2019, his grandson, Michael Kalantarov of Queens, New York, took a trip to this heart of the Pskov Oblast in Western Russia to give his tribute to his grandfather, and made a call to the Russian Defense Ministry about establishing a memorial fund so that all of these small, out-of-the-way countryside cemeteries would be documented and remembered to grandchildren who now live not just in the former Soviet Union, but in places like America and beyond. This is the story of Moshiach Kalantarov, where I had the honor of translating it for the Bukharian Times in 2019. Continuing on, when we look at the list of casualties and just how massive the Bukharian contribution had been to the war, in Israel, there was a memorial book published in their memory. Let me just find the name. Okay, I don't have it here, but a memorial book was published, and it has the list of all the Bukharian Jewish veterans by their names and last names and middle names, and you can see the cities, how many participated, how many died, how many disappeared without a trace, how many were unknown, and how many returned. So look at Uzbekistan, the city of Andijan, 404 Bukharian Jewish veterans, only 160 came back home at the end of the war. Look at the city of Samarkand, one of the largest Bukharian Jewish populations and one of the earliest cities in Central Asia to have a Bukharian Jewish population, more than 1,500 years ago. 1,575 veterans went off to fight, 602 came back alive. 636 documented dead. And then other cities in Tajikistan, Dushanbe, during the war, known as Stalinabad, 202 veterans, only 59 came back. Khudrand, 191, only 80 came back. And from Kazakhstan, you look at the city of Kazalinsk, 42 went off to fight, and only 14 came back. So even though we don't often think of Central Asian Jews as among the victims of the Holocaust, when you see such numbers of those who participated, those who did not come back, and the few who returned, you could see that for them it's also part of their history to avenge the murder of the Ashkenazim and to demonstrate their patriotism. Now we look at the names in this memorial book. This is just the last name Abayev from cities like Kokand, Bukhara, Samarkand, Margilan, Tashkent, and others. It's a mix of names that symbolizes the Soviet experience. Some of them have Hebrew-related names like Berach Abayev. Some of them have Russian names like Boris Abayev or Grigory Abayev. Some of them have Central Asian names, Jura, Doni Abayev. And names, Hebrew names like Malkiel or Yisrael or Ilazar. But then you have names like Yoshor Abayev. So it's a mix of Persian, Arabic, Uzbek, Russian, and Hebrew names that are also an example of the Bukharian Jewish experience. You can see most of them born in the 1910s and 1920s. These are people who were either teens or in their 20s during the war. You can see how many of them were killed. It says Pagib, Pagib, Pagib. So dead, 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 came back, disappeared without a trace, killed, came back, disappeared without a trace, came back, disappeared without a trace. So you can see just a number here of how many of them did not make it back from the war. Documentaries have also been made about Ashkenazi refugees that, one moment, let me just get notes because I want to make sure that my notes are accurate. I describe this experience. On account of its reputation, the city of Tashkent as a developed city with a reliable food supply, the city of Tashkent became a magnet for Soviet citizens fleeing east to avoid becoming Nazi casualties. The Bukharian Jewish community during World War II sheltered and provided assistance to Ashkenazi Jewish refugees. Bukharian Jewish cemeteries accepted Ashkenazi dead. There were also a few marriages between Bukharian Jews and Ashkenazi Jewish refugees. I'll give you one example. In Jamaica States, I remember there was a synagogue president by the name of Yaakov Weinstein of a Bukharian Jewish synagogue. Now, Weinstein is the Russian version of Weinstein. And I was wondering, what's a Weinstein doing as the president of Bukharian synagogue? So he told me his grandfather was a Weinstein who who fled to Tashkent during the war and married a Bukharian Jewish woman, and he was raised in the Bukharian Jewish community. So that's how you have Bukharians with last names like Weinstein, among other examples. So there were a few marriages between these communities and established contact between them during the war. Another example is the Chabad community. Chabad Hasidim operated underground yeshivas, even though it was illegal under communism. Chabad found a friendly shelter in Samarkand and Tashkent because Bukharian Jews are much more traditional than Ashkenazi Jews. And from Central Asia, Chabad activists tried to sneak across other borders of Central Asia to make their way to the West and to British Palestine. In Samarkand, they assisted the refugees and ran underground yeshivas. But generally, there was little contact otherwise between Ashkenazim and Bukharian Jews, with the exception of the families that provided shelter and the Chabad activists. Best example of that would be a book by Hillel Zaltzman called The War Years. Overall, there were 1.1 million people who had settled in Uzbekistan during World War II. 70% of those 1.1 million Soviet citizens were Ashkenazi Jews. And one example was my great aunt, who came from Moldova and lived in a kolkhoz or collective farm in Kyrgyzstan during the war. So these Ashkenazi Jews lived in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and other points east. As many as 300,000 of these deportees perished due to disease and starvation. So even though Tashkent had a reputation as a city of food, in reality, there wasn't a lot of food between the military, the indigenous residents, and the refugees. And 300,000 of them died. And my great aunt, her father, was buried in Kyrgyzstan during the war. Other Ashkenazi refugees signed up to fight or were drafted to fight in the Red Army. So after fleeing Eastern Europe, they were sent back to Eastern Europe to fight. So many of them died there too. But among those 300,000 who died in Central Asia, none of them died as Holocaust victims. In 2004, a group of local researchers at the Central Asia Research Project, led by Professor Saijon Kurbanov, selected and digitized a list of 152,000 registration cards of Soviet evacuees in Central Asia at the Central State Archives of the Republic of Uzbekistan in Tashkent. The eastern or Shark quarter of Samarkand, the Jewish school became an orphanage directed by Boris Nesimovich Fuzailov. The Gumbaz synagogue became a field hospital for Soviet and Polish soldiers. In the city of Margilan, the community leader, or Kalontar, Mullah Menachem Yadgarov, rented a mill in a remote village from a sympathetic Muslim family where they secretly made matzah during the war, near the city of Margilan. The head of the Hevra Kadisha in the city of Margilan also buried Ashkenazi refugees in the Jewish cemetery. In the city of Namangan, the family of Yaakov Boruchov lived in a neighborhood with 8 other Bukharian families. Each family had a corresponding Ashkenazi refugee family in their home. In his home, there was a doctor in Yaakov Boruchov's family in Namangan. As a result, Yaakov Boruchov became inspired to become a doctor as well, with interest in European music, photography, and journalism. Among the Ashkenazim who became integrated into Uzbek society during the war was a sculptor, Yaakov Shapiro, who came to the Fergana Valley from the city of Zhytomyr in Ukraine. He remained in Uzbekistan after the war, where he attended university and became a leading sculptor of public art. Among his sculptures is a sculpture of Uzbek cosmonaut Vladimir Janibekov, a source of local pride. Shapiro's grandfather was not so fortunate. He stayed in Kiev when the Nazis invaded. He thought the Germans were civilized. They're the people who invented classical music. And Yaakov Shapiro's grandfather was among the 33,771 Jews murdered instantly in Babi Yar. In 2017, Bukharian Jewish filmmaker Boris Babayev made a Russian language documentary, Большое сердце Tashkent, Big Heart of Tashkent, about this chapter in Uzbekistan's history of Bukharian Jews and Uzbeks sheltering Ashkenazi Jewish refugees. Let me just pull out another note. Another example of this inter-ethnic cooperation during the war was a Tashkent blacksmith named Shahmed Shamahmudov and his wife Bakhri Akhramova. Bakhri Akhramova and Shahmed Shamahmudov adopted 16 orphans from across the Soviet Union of different nationalities. So like 16 republics, 16 orphans, and that included 2 Jews. These 2 were given new names. They were taught Uzbek and raised as secular Uzbek Soviet citizens. Of the 400,000 children who were evacuated to Uzbekistan, half of them were orphans. 4 of Shah Mahmudov's adoptees were later returned to their relatives. 2 of his adoptees ended up marrying each other, an Uzbek and a Belarusian. From the front line, a senior Soviet lieutenant named Levitsky sent him several hundred rubles and promised to send the same amount every month for as long as he lives. Levitsky lost his own children in the Holocaust and wanted to support Shah Mahmudov's adoptees. These are pictures of refugees in Central Asia during World War II. Another example, but this is the Chabad experience. Rabbi Hillel Zaltzman's book Samarkand and Rabbi Shlomo Chai Niyazov of Borough Park writing Defiance in Samarkand. This is a memorial at for Rivka Niyazova, a matriarch of the family, who helped to support the Chabad community in Samarkand after the war. And her family sheltered Bukharian and Ashkenazi refugees. That's Hillel Zaltzman returning to Samarkand at the Registan Square. There's more I want to say. When I was talking about that earlier list of Bukharian Jewish veterans and casualties, that list was created by David Kalontar of Israel, also formerly of Samarkand, called Kniga Pameti, a book of memory. Another thing I also wanted to point out about the Bukharian Jewish experience during World War II was a famous popular poet of Uzbekistan, Gafur Gulyamov, or Gafur Gulyam. Gafur Gulyam, most of his poetry was written in the Central Asian style, but was largely because it was the Stalin's reign, largely about praising collective farms, the liberation of women, because women became equal citizens under the Soviets, no more veils, no more social restrictions, about praising communism. But during World War II, he wrote a very unusual poem praising the Jews. And the poem is just full of history. It's the most philo-Semitic poem you could find during the Soviet experience. And here's how it went. The solidarity on the front lines, where Uzbek and Tajik soldiers protected their Bukharian Jewish comrades, was also expressed in poetry. The theme of interethnic friendship was necessary during the war, as Uzbekistan absorbed refugees of many ethnicities during the war. Publication of such a pro-Jewish poem was an exception to the rule during the long and dark reign of Stalin. The poem ends on a Marxist note, keeping with the official policies, and it goes like this. I am Jewish, don't say my name. Hey, vampire, about my pedigree from my great-great-grandmother. When your ancestor was scalp-horned, bull-scalp, crowning head off, the salt, the fire, the Nibelungs, this fictional German mythology, Gothic, you didn't have Lancet towers or Gothic churches. Well, the Jews were thundering the voice of the Torah. The Gospels came from the Jews, he mentions here. Christ came from the Jews. And the old Jewish Torah, called the Son of Mary, millions of books will tell about my pedigree. The smoke of exile is bitter, but in my eyes, I am a Jew. It says the verses of the Quran were inspired by Jews as well. The pharaohs galloped over the deserts after us, but then the cold paws of the sea grabbed us. So the pharaoh drowning in the Red Sea appears in this poem by Gafur Gulyam. And it says, all are silent. The pharaohs, the prophets, the Hakans, the Suleimans are silent. Probably referring to a Turkish sultan. I am Jewish. Don't say my name, a vampire. Let a sharp fish bone be stuck in your throat. Sounds like a Central Asian curse. And talks about how the Jews terrified the world with their morality and survival. So all of that appears here. And then it says, Russian, Uzbek, Jew, Belarusian, the hand is equally firm in battle, that to free the globe from the rot of fascism appears in this Gafur Gulyam poem called I Am a Jew, or Man Yehudi, or Ya Yevrei, in the languages of the Uzbeks. And here's how it appears in Russian. Я еврей, имя мое не произноси. Эй, вампир, а родословной моей, про прабабки своей спроси, когда предок твой скальпом рогатым, бывший скальпом, вечная башку, знать не знал, что такое и соль, и огонь, и лунги, и небелунги. So in Russian actually rhymes. And I'm sure it does in Uzbek as well, because Gafur Gulyam was literate in Uzbek and Russian. So that's his poem, Man Yehudi. And here are some other pictures of Gafur Gulyam. His house actually is a museum, so people are welcome to visit it. His family maintains the place. So here you could see I Am a Jew by Gafur Gulam. Now, another story about Bukharian Jews is the story of Bukharian Jews during World War II in Western Europe. When the Russian Revolution broke out, the Bukharian Jews went from riches to rags. You see, under the Russian Empire of the Tsars, while the Ashkenazi Jews were persecuted, as famously depicted in Fiddler on the Roof, the Jews of Georgia, the Caucasian Mountains, Central Asia were actually first-class citizens and loyal to the Tsar, helping the Russians conquer their respective regions. So as a result, the Bukharian Jews did pretty well. When the Bolshevik Revolution broke out, many wealthy Bukharian Jewish merchants escaped to British Palestine and to the West, with a Bukharian community functioning in Paris. And when Paris was occupied by the Nazis, there was a question whether the Bukharian Jews of Paris would suffer the same fate as the Ashkenazi Jews of France. And it was here that the first Bukharian Jew to graduate from the Sorbonne, the first Bukharian Jew to graduate from a Western medical school, his name was Asaf Achildiev, in Western Europe, known as Dr. Asaf Achildi, born in Samarkand, had met with an Iranian diplomat, Abdul Hussein Sardari, to come up with a plan. Asaf Achildi's family knows what it's like to hide one's Judaism, because Asaf Achildi is a descendant of the Chala, which in Tajik means neither this nor that. These are Bukharian Jews who were forced to convert to Islam, but secretly maintained their Judaism until the Russian conquest, when they again came out publicly as Jews. It was during the Nazi occupation that this sympathetic Iranian diplomat, Abdul Hussein Sardari, cultivated relations with Nazi and Vichy French officials, promoting the argument that Iranian Jews living in France are members of the Aryan race who are distinct from Ashkenazi Jews, that these are Aryans who simply follow the Jewish religion, but their blood is not Jewish. And among those Iranian Jews, Abdul Hussein Sardari included the Mountain Jews, the Georgian Jews, and the Bukharian Jews. And nicknamed the Persian Schindler, Abdul Hussein Sardari submitted a list of all the Bukharian Jews in Paris who should not be affected by the Holocaust. Within the German diplomatic corps, the older aristocratic diplomats were less anti-Semitic than the newer members of the diplomatic corps, who were brainwashed Nazis. The Nazis debated whether these Juguti, the made-up term to describe these believers of Judaism who were ethnically Central Asian, whether the Juguti are really Jews or not. So as they were going back and forth, remember, Iran was a neutral country during World War II. The Nazis wanted to cultivate relations with them as well. And so initially the Nazis did not touch the Central Asian Jews. So between Asaf Achildiev and Abdul Hussein Sardari. Another story of that was Givi Gabliani, a member of the SS who was a member of the Georgian community. These were ethnic Georgians who wanted an independent Georgian state, but because the Bolsheviks had conquered Georgia, they fled to France. Givi Gabliani and Mikhail Kedia. Mikhail Kedia is nicknamed the Georgian Schindler. He drafted a list of Georgian Jews living in Paris and argued these are ethnic Georgians. They all have last names ending with Shvili or Idze. They all have Georgian first names. They're culturally Georgian, but they just happen to believe in Judaism and reject Jesus. And they argued that these are not Jews. Mikhail Kedia and Givi Gabliani teamed up to convince the Nazis that the Georgians living in Paris are all Georgians. None of them are really Jews. And so he also helped save their lives. So between Asaf Achildi and Givi Gabliani and Mikhail Kedia and Abdul Hussein Sardari, there were Jews who walked in plain sight of Nazi officials in France and were able to survive. Yeah, pretty strange history considering that today Iran hates Israel. And yeah, that. But this was the Iran under the Shah monarchy, the Pahlavi dynasty, which was very pro-Jewish. So that story of Bukharian Jews, nearly 2,400 Jews in France were holding Iranian passports in March 1943. After Iran entered the war as an allied country, Sardari worked closely with the Swiss embassy to protect individuals holding Iranian passports. Now, the height of the Nazi army is when they reached Mount Elbrus, the highest point in the Caucasus, on the border of Georgia and Soviet Russia. What stood in the way of the Nazis conquering the oil fields of the Caspian Sea and approaching the Turkish and Iranian border and marching towards the Middle East was the Red Army and the Mountain Jews and Georgian Jews who fought in the Red Army. Now, were there any Mountain Jews who did suffer under the Holocaust? Yes, there is an example of that. That is the city of Nalchik. Nalchik is the capital of Kabardino-Balkaria, one of the ethnic republics in southern Russia bordering on the Caucasus. In this city, the Mountain Jewish community was established here in 1847 after the Circassian resistance was suppressed by the Russians, resulting in open land for Russian and Jewish settlers. The Jews of Nalchik were also fleeing the rebellion of Imam Shamil of neighboring Chechnya in the 1840s, 1850s. During the Holocaust, the city was briefly occupied by the Nazis, who immediately arrested and murdered the local Ashkenazim. With support from their Muslim Kabardian neighbors, German commanders were informed that there was an ethnic group living in Kabardino-Balkaria called the Tats, who spoke the Tat language, a Persian-derived language. And the Tats are not racially Jewish, even though the Tats is just another word to describe mountain Jews. Their custom can be compared, the culture of protecting your Jewish neighbors among the Kabardino-Balkarians is called Adige Habza, the idea that your guest should be protected like a member of the family, that you should protect your guests with your life. It's very similar to the Albanian custom of Besa, which is why during the Holocaust, Albania is the only country in Europe that had more Jews at the end of the war than at the beginning of the war, because the Albanians en masse protected the local Jews living there, as well as Jewish refugees. So similar happened in Kabardino-Balkaria. The doomed Ashkenazim also argued that they were related to the Tats, but it did not work. Not to presume that all mountain Jews had survived the war, as decisions were made locally by German commanders, depending on the village, the towns, and the cities. For example, in 2 collective farms outside of Nalchik, 850 Jews were killed. Betrayals also took place on an individual level. The earliest example of mountain Jews who were killed in the Holocaust was in the Crimea, where there was a Jewish collective farm operated by the Soviets. Initially, the Nazis passed by the farm thinking, oh, this is just another Caucasian ethnic group. But then somebody informed on them, and Nazis came back and massacred them. So that was in Crimea. And so that was Nalchik. Among the Jewish contributions to music of Kabardino-Balkaria is the birthplace of Hatzron al-Hassab, who sings in Bulgarian, in Hebrew, and in Russian. Another city, another place I want to mention concerning mountain Jews, the Crimean kolkhoz or collector was a town called Shahumyan. 114 Jews killed there in March 1942. In July of that year, the Nazis approached Caucasus. 472 Jews killed in the village of Bogdanovka in the Stavropol region, north of Kabardino-Balkaria. City of Nalchik was occupied for 2.5 months by the Nazis. The mountain Jews were able to pass themselves off as a Caucasian group, protected by their Kabardian neighbors. But one of the heroes here, who would be described as the Kabardian Schindler, is a lawyer named Semyon Shadov. Semyon Shadov turned to Field Marshal von Kleist, arguing that the Tats are not Jews. In the village of Islami, also in Kabardino-Balkaria, there was a Shalomov family sheltered by their neighbors while the father was in the army. During a bombing, his wife became blind and soon died. The children were taken in as strangers by other villagers. A policeman from the village tried to hand them over to the Nazis. The Aksakals, or village elders, warned him not to do it. And so the children were saved. The town of the city of Mozdok, which is in North Ossetia. In Mozdok, the Jews took matters into their own hands. They organized a leather factory to appear useful to the Germans. And likely by not registering themselves off as Jews, they were able to survive. Nalchik, the Germans, however, were still unsure. Are the Tats really Jews, or are they really a Caucasian group? And so in 1943, just as the Nazis were about to organize a massacre, what they call an action, a Red Army unit led by Colonel Haskil Pinchasov liberated the city. As soon as Pinchasov entered Nalchik, the first thing he asked was, are there still Jews here? And there were. So it's almost like a stuff of action movies. You could see here Pinchasov's unit re-entering Nalchik and liberating the Jewish community here under the red banner. Something needs to be said about it is that Shatiel Pinchasov, after liberating Nalchik, marched with the Red Army for more than 2,000 miles all the way to Berlin. In 1965, he lobbied to build a monument in the village of Bogdanovka to the Jewish dead, a rare example of a monument to Jewish Soviet citizens before the perestroika. 1988, he was buried in Nalchik under an elaborate monument. That was Colonel Haskil Pinchasov. The city of Derbent on the Caspian Sea, the oldest city in Russia, one of the oldest cities with a mountain Jewish communities, more than 1,000 years old. There was a native, Shatiel Abramov, who returned to combat 7 times. Each time he was injured, he recuperated and decided to come back and fight more. returned 7 times. A street in Derbent carries the name of Shatiel Abramov. Manovach Dadashev was a journalist, poet, collector of folklore in his community, also from Derbent, killed in combat in 1943. Isai Elizarov was an athlete, the first documented mountain Jew to ascend Mount Elbrus. He was killed in combat in 1944 in the city of Nalchik. On the slopes of Mount Elbrus, there's a street named after Isai Elizarov. So there are streets throughout southern Russia named after these mountain Jewish veterans. Nazis sought to conquer again the Caucasus for its oil fields and serving as a bridge to Middle East and Central Asia. And it was the mountain Jews who helped stop that. Among the mountain Jews captured by the Germans, many of them were able to avoid becoming Holocaust casualties by identifying with the ethnic groups of the Caucasus. Many stories of heroism among them. One great example is Hanukayev of Dagestan, captured in Ukraine in 1943, sent to a prisoner of war camp in Italy. He escaped and was captured and tortured, but then he escaped for a second time and joined the Italian communist partisans who helped capture Mussolini and executed him at the end of the war. Because Hanukayev had fought with a communist resistance group in Italy, unlike other Soviet prisoners of war, he came back as a hero rather than being sent to Siberia. That's the story of Hanukayev. This is the monument to Haskil Pinchasov in Nalchik with all of his medals at the Jewish cemetery of the city. This is a view of the city of Nalchik, and that's the slopes of the Caucasus Mountains. This is southern Russia, and across that mountain is Soviet Georgia, and beyond that, Turkey and Iran. The mountain Jews, led by an organization called Stmegi, which is based in Russia, has its own news outlet with online and published news, also publishes books called Historia y Kultura Gorskih Evreev, History and Culture of Mountain Jews. Sadly, the book is in Russian, not in English, but maybe it'll be translated soon. With philanthropists like German Zakharyayev and Gad Nisanov of Moscow, the stories of mountain Jews are being preserved and documented. Examples of mountain Jews include, like I mentioned earlier, Haskil Pinchasov, Shetiel Abramov, Manovach Dadashev, Isai Elizarov. Mountain Jewish women also participate in the war effort, some of them as nurses, others as radio dispatchers to send broadcasts to the army during the war. So examples here, let's see if there's a name written here. A little bit hard to see, but I remember this one came from a mountain Jewish veteran. This is another book, Svetlana Danilova, also born in the city of Nalchik. She now lives in Brooklyn, the preeminent historian of the mountain Jewish experience, but her books are mostly in Russian. Wrote a book called Gorskih Evreev, Historia v Nashi Dni, in History in Our Days. That includes also a sizable chapter on the experience of mountain Jews in Kabardino-Balkaria and in the Red Army. It's a monument in Kabardino-Balkaria to the Soviet citizens killed, many of them Jews as well. This is a Nagradny list, meaning honorary certificate, to Leonid Alexandrovich Ashurov. Ashurov is a mountain Jewish last name, in September 1943. This is from the Stmegi website, showing so many examples of mountain Jewish heroes during the war. So because they have a very well-organized community and very generous philanthropists who keep these stories going. For example, Rosa Adamova, woman warrior, woman mother. Then it says here, Emil Yakubov, a big poet of a small village. Aron Matayev, 2 orders of glory for a tank commander. Mikhail Yevdaevich Abramov, a Tsarsky Rebyonik, meaning a child of the Russian Empire, veteran of World War II. Margarita Abramova, who was a mountain Jew who lived in besieged Leningrad, a city that was surrounded by the Nazis for 900 days and held out. She was among the defenders of Leningrad. Hanukayev, hero of Italian resistance. So many examples here. Now, among the Georgian Jewish veterans, specific examples, Chaim Aronovich Mamistvalov, senior lieutenant, born 1922, died 1990, an artillery commander here. Another example, Ilya Davidovich Sepiashvili, senior commander of an artillery battery, 3 times wounded and came back to fight. Last battle was outside the Polish city of Lodz, which had the largest surviving ghetto in 1944. And among those who liberated that ghetto was Ilya Davidovich Sepiashvili. So mountain Jews fighting to, help the Ashkenazi Jews, as well as the Soviet effort. This is a picture of Georgian and Jewish veterans in the Red Army on the slopes of Mount Elbrus, so mountain combat here. Another one, Abram Aronovich Janashvili, born in 1896. I mean, this man was already in his mid-40s when the war started, and says here, at the time of the Crimean campaign, served nearly 4,500 veterans, helping them as a medic. So that appears here. Now, I mentioned that throughout the Soviet experience, there were very few monuments to the Holocaust dead, because the Soviet Union downplayed the Jewish involvement in the war and downplayed the Jewish victimhood in the war, fearing that the loss of so many Jewish lives could be used as a pretext for Zionism, which it was, meaning so many Jews are killed for being Jews, maybe the Jews should have their own country. But the Soviets did not support Zionism, and so whatever monuments there were to Nazi massacres or Red Army soldiers who were killed, it was because they were Soviet citizens. But within the semi-privacy of Jewish cemeteries, there were monuments to Jewish Red Army veterans. This is in Samarkand, in the Bukharian Jewish cemetery, the Kabristan, or Land of Graves. And this is also, I'm not sure if this was Tashkent or Nalchik, but this is also the Jewish cemetery. And in most Jewish cemeteries, Red Army veterans usually have their military rank and their medals posted on their gravestones as a symbol of pride. I should also mention one final thing. There is a song very popular in the Soviet Union called Белые журавли, White Cranes, a song that was written by an Avar, meaning a Muslim from Dagestan. One moment, let me just view it as a slideshow. And even though it was written by a non-Jew, the composer of the musical score was a Jew. Mark Bernès, a singer who popularized it, was a Jew. So the producer, the composer, and the singer behind Белые журавли were all Soviet Jews, largely Ashkenazi. But the reason why I feel it's a good way of ending the slide is because, let me just see if I could find the song on YouTube. Is because, again, even though it's a quintessentially Soviet song and a very emotional song, it is derived largely from the Jewish experience. The idea that when a veteran dies, he becomes a bird in the sky, a crane. It's legendary, it's sentimental, but also just tells us how we feel now that so many veterans are dead. Let me see if I could search it in Russian. Белые журавли. Here's one example. Let's see. Mark Bernès, right here, Soviet Jewish singer with English subtitles. This song brings me to tears because both of my grandfathers were combat veterans. My maternal grandfather, he lost 3 of his sisters, brother and parents, in combat. My maternal grandmother, she lost her father in combat outside of Stalingrad, digging defensive trenches. My maternal grandmother's brother-in-law also killed in combat. And as I said earlier, my paternal grandfather lost his arm in the deadliest battle of the war as a teenager.
Они до сей поры с времен тех дальних летят и подают нам голоса. И потому так часто и печаль мы замолкаем, глядя в небеса.
That is the song White Cranes, or Белые журавли, perhaps the most emotional song documenting the Soviet Jewish experience, even though the song was composed and written many years after the war. And you can see also the Soviet Jewish experience is being remembered in Israel, where on the coast, there's a monument to Red Army veterans, and the monument is in the shape of crane wings, because the song Белые журавли. There's a picture of Shimon Peres, born in Belarus, and later becoming Israel's oldest and longest living politician, with Vladimir Putin in better days in the earlier years of this millennium, when he visited this monument in Israel to Jews who fought in the Red Army, a long belated recognition. This is a picture of Bukharian and mountain veterans in Israel. And you can see this is Aryeh Deri, the head of the Shas Sephardic religious political party, and Amnon Cohen, the first Bukharian Jew elected to the Israeli Knesset, being here with veterans. This down here is a picture of mountain Jews at a memorial in southern Russia. And this is also a memorial in Krasnaya Sloboda in Azerbaijan to Soviet Jews who fought in the Red Army. This is a monument in the Jewish cemetery, and by Irina Mikhailova, a book called Gorsky Evreyi в Великой Отечественной войне, Mountain Jews in the Great Patriotic War. Sadly, the book's in Russian, but maybe it will be translated to English for American audiences. I think this is this is it for the slides. So I wanted to again repeat the main reason why I shared this slideshow on mountain Jews, Bukharian Jews, and Georgian Jews who fought in World War II is because so often when we think about the World War II experience, we think about it as a European war or as a Far Eastern war. We think about the Red Army experience. We think about the narrative told by the Russian Federation, by Vladimir Putin. And sometimes we forget that all the republics of the Soviet Union had contributed to the Soviet victory. That includes the Soviet soldiers of Ukraine, Belarus, the Caucasus, Central Asia. That includes the combat veterans of all the ethnic and religious minorities, as well as the labor veterans who contributed as well culturally and industrially. So when you see these parades, don't forget about the people who did not make it to these parades, those who did not live to it, those who might not have necessarily supported what Russia is doing today, because these veterans view it as a war between good and evil, a war for civilization, and a war for Jewish survival. Thank you so much. And be sure to look forward to some of my other videos on YouTube. And I also teach classes in Jewish history at Touro College and contribute essays to the New York History website, Forgotten New York. Thank you so much.